the business case. And I suggest respectfully that as business people, we can look at this from the point of view of risk. And when we talk about risk here, we talk about climate risk, and we talk about physical risk, and we talk about transition risk. And of course, to consider these risks, we need to look at a set of assumptions. The assumptions we have here are the mirror of the assumptions about reductions in tons per year. And note, again, this is before Glasgow. Note that business as usual, which is where we are now, let me just lock that out. Current policy has us 3.1 to 3.7, and this is where we need to be. So let's say we accept there is a case, a business case based on risk. Well, how do we tackle the measurement of risk? What we do in Dragon, and I recommend to all of us as business people here in Vietnam, we consider the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, known as TCFD. This gives us guidance on how to approach risk management. First of all, we need to establish a governance structure. We secondly need to articulate a strategy towards climate risk. Then we need to identify what risks we are looking at. And lastly, we need to set metrics and targets. And we have here a set of metrics on the right, and I'll come to these in a minute. So what I'd like to do is to take you through very briefly an exercise we did in Dragon last year and show you the results. So we wanted to assess risk in financial terms. So we took one of the funds at Dragon, we run funds. We took a big fund, $2 billion US, and we based it on an assumption of business as usual. So this is what we might say is a worst case scenario, but that for us is the baseline against which we measure our performance. The exercise was conducted by a Hong Kong specialist using NASA data from the US, GPS, and machine learning. And the results we reported to the London Stock Exchange in June of this year. So physical risk is, as Ambassador Gareth mentioned, one of the big sets of risks that we face in Vietnam. And while we have always talked, and Vietnamese people have always taught me that in Vietnam chúng tôi sống chung với lũ, I think the effects of climate change are going to make that very difficult. Here, for example, we see estimates of the flooding in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City by the year 2030, based on our business as usual assumptions. We see massive strengthening in typhoon winds, 130% stronger in the south and 50% stronger in the center. These are the predicted paths of typhoons. We see storm surge and coastal flooding increasing 50% by 2030. And of course, temperatures becoming hot, exceeding 35 degrees, especially in the south, where of course it becomes extremely difficult to work. So these are real risks. So what we did was we looked at our investments. These are the companies in which we invest. We've concealed the identity for confidentiality purposes. This is the historical, this is the historical risk in dollar terms of damage from climate events from 2000 to 2010. And this is the forecast set of risks, set of numbers from 2030 to 2050 in any one year. These are annual risk numbers for the various kinds of risk. Lots of numbers. Don't look at them, look at this. This is the historical total. This is the forecast total. The difference between 2000, 2010 and 2030, 2050 is a factor of 6.4 times. That's a very large increase in risk, I'm sure you will agree. Lots of numbers on this page, but basically the key is this. The companies in which we invest can be expected to face in any one year damages of $1 billion. Our ownership of those companies means we face in our fund an annual loss of $48 million. Let's turn to the second risk, which is transition risk. This is the risk of us. These are the risks involved in us moving to a lower carbon environment, as we've been hearing from both Kyle and Ambassador Gareth. So when we talk about transition risk, we mean removing the emissions from our businesses. And we talk very neatly of carbon dioxide equivalent. And of course, as Gareth mentioned, we have various noxious gases that we release into the atmosphere, some of which are more dangerous than others. When we look at these, we look in terms of 3 scopes. So scope 1 is our direct emissions from what we do in our business. And scope 2 is the indirect emissions from purchased energy, while scope 3 is the rest of our business supply chain, in and out. I regret to say that technology is not yet as advanced to allow us to measure scope 3 terribly easily. So the numbers we have are just for scope 1 and for scope 2. Now, I think most of us know that Vietnam right now is not a large emitter. Indeed, the population is 1.2% of the world, and I believe the emissions are only 0.7 or 8%. Not a problem today, perhaps. And prior to COVID, prior to the Glasgow COP talks, Vietnam's predicted path was well short of where it had undertaken to be. But at Glasgow, the Prime Minister committed to this, to 0 by 2050. So the idea of being aware of our greenhouse gas emissions is no longer a luxury, it is a necessity. Back to our fund, these are the sectors in which we invest, and you can see the emissions vary very, very much from sector to sector. When we look again at our portfolio, the companies in which we invest, we can see equally very big differences in the emissions. This is a relative measure, the weighted average carbon intensity. And here are the absolute emissions of greenhouse gases per company. These, of course, are estimated numbers by the by our Hong Kong consultant, because Vietnamese companies do not yet emit. Do not yet publish emission figures. Anyway, again, lots more numbers, but let's just focus on these two. This relative measure of 97 tons is a reflection I'll come to in a minute, and this is the absolute number of tons on the portfolio. So again, let's compare currently either on a relative scale or an absolute scale. We can see that our fund is not a big emitter when compared with emerging markets or when compared with responsible companies in the world, responsible companies in emerging markets or in the Pacific. However, if we want to follow the Prime Minister's lead, we'll need to lower this number to 0. And if we don't lower this number to 0, we're going to have to pay for it. And how much do we pay? Well, the price of carbon in Europe at the moment is about $100 a ton. So that gives us a transition figure of $19 million a year. So let's put the physical number and the transition number together, and we have an annual figure, a contingent liability, we could say, of nearly 3.5% of our net assets in any 1 year, Now, I stress, these numbers are just numbers, and they're based on emissions. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to do the same exercise again this year, and we're going to share the results again, and we're going to look at the results, and we're going to hope that we can reduce that number every year. Meanwhile, what is everyone else doing? Well, as we've been hearing, regulators around the world, Hong Kong, the EU, the UK, France, now the US, also China, and of course Vietnam, are introducing regulations on climate. Number one, they want to prevent us from saying things that we are not doing, what is called in English greenwashing. And number two, they want to encourage us to produce information about our impact on climate. Elsewhere, legislators, governments are doing other things. In Britain, Gareth and my country, there is a proposal made just last week that that GDP could be recalculated to include measures of natural capital, some of the things that Ambassador Gareth was talking about. There's talk, of course, of taxes on carbon. At a business level, business associations are introducing new standards. The ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, is something we'll be hearing a great deal more about. And what about us as businesses? I'm a business person, just like all of you. What can we do? I think we can become aware, we can think about the risk, and we can prepare to reduce it. Good luck, and thank you for listening, and I'll hand back to the MC.
Vâng, một lần nữa xin cảm ơn ngài Dominic Scriven